We're talking about the nexus between occult and horror. I think before we go anywhere within this, we need to first define the occult. So
Well,
how do you define that?
the occult and horror are, in actuality, two very different things, although they're related and they intersect. The occult is a term that derives from Latin occultus or occulta, that means hidden or secret, and it was a term that came into use during the early Renaissance to describe the spirituality of the pre-Christian world, the initiatory, esoteric spiritual traditions of Greece, Rome, Egypt, Persia, that had largely vanished, at least in the Western world and through much of the Mediterranean basin, when Christianity swept through the area. And so when translators and scholars and religious figures were seeking to make reference to some of the ideas of the antique world that were reemerging during the Renaissance, including Hermeticism and including all kinds of mystery traditions and practices ranging from astrology to divination to alchemy to spell work to number symbolism to so-called sacred geometry and so on and so forth. As they were struggling to make reference to these things, which belonged to a world that had effectively vanished with the advent of Christianity, and then during the long centuries of the early medieval period, or what we sometimes refer to as the Dark Ages, they settled upon occult or hidden or secret. And this Latin term, occulta or occultus, was transmuted into English as the word occult, which came into more widespread use more or less in the early 1500s. So a lot of what we think of as esoteric practice today extends back to that Renaissance occult revival, which in turn extended back to late antiquity and an attempt to re-understand, reinterpret some of the ancient practices, again, from Kabbalah to spellcasting to alchemy to every form of divination and initiatory awareness or development. Horror, on the other hand, can be derived from any number of folk practices, traditions, beliefs, indigenous beliefs, all kinds of different practices, outlooks, mythologies, and I use that term in the highest sense, that were part of the human story all around the world, that were intrinsic to different parts of the world, sometimes with incredible congruity, whether it be the story of the werewolf or the story of the golem that transmutes into the Frankenstein monster, or whether it be conceptions of vampires or zombies or all kinds of evil or maleficent spirits or ghosts or poltergeists. Every culture from across the world, from Polynesia to Siberia, has an incredible set of stories that are remarkably congruent. And sometimes these things overlap directly with the occult. If you're interested in the question of afterlife intelligences or the psychical survival of death, if you're interested in the work of a magician like John Dee, a late Renaissance era magician, contacting spirits from the beyond, or how those things populate the occult literature of the era, then you can see, an immediate intersection with horror. So the two are different, but they kind of crisscross together.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, when you're starting to look at things like necromancy, bringing people back from the dead,
right,
communicating with them and all that kind of stuff. But I feel like as far as the genre of horror goes, there's always a tied vein of malevolence, but that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case for occultism. Occultism being like, it can be different spiritual practices, different things like that. So how has the occult become so demonized that when people think of it, they immediately resort to malevolence? They believe it. They believe it's evil.
Right. Well, it's an interesting question. Most horror is associated with malevolence, as you were referencing, although there are some supernatural thrillers, like the movie that Clint Eastwood directed called Hereafter, which involves a psychic played by Matt Damon, who reaches figures, from the afterlife, and it's not necessarily malevolent. It's told in a very ingenuous, sympathetic way. So there are, in our time, some supernatural thrillers that might be how can I put this? Might be sort of in the family tree of horror, that are not necessarily framing the occult as malevolent. But the key question, as you just put it, one of the questions that defines our civilization today is, how did the occult come to be associated with evil? And to some extent, it goes back to late antiquity, where the early church was in a struggle for dominance with the lingering and really persistent nature-based or so-called pagan traditions, particularly throughout the Hellenic world. And eventually, with the conversion of the Emperor Constantine and a wave of other events, Christianity gained dominance within the Hellenic world and was in the ascendancy. And the early church did what human beings always do when they gain victory in a given situation, cultural or otherwise, which is that they I'm going to use the word demonize the other side, which typifies the point that I'm making. The term demon itself was a neutral Greek term for spirit, and the very process that I'm describing led that term to be associated with malevolent spirits or entities, whereas that term had been used in the ancient Greek world in an entirely neutral way, in the same way that we might use the term spirit today in English. And so, of course, it's human nature that when somebody wins a great cultural struggle, they get to classify the other side however they like. So the early church fathers classified the lingering nature worshippers and pagan powers as practitioners of some kind of malevolent, evil, wicked practice. And if the pagan powers had won that struggle, I always hasten to add, they would have done the exact same thing to the church. There's no easy good guys and bad guys, and I'm in this corner and everybody else is in this corner. No, it's as simple as human nature. It's the human malady that we define everyone other than ourselves as necessarily being on the side of something evil, and that's what the pagan powers would have done to the early church if the pagan powers had been in ascendancy. So that's more or less where it began. And then as an occult revival got underway, which we were talking about earlier during the Renaissance, there was eventually, following the death of Queen Elizabeth and going into the early 1600s and the advent of what is called the 30 Years' War, there was a massive church backlash against the occult experimentation of the Renaissance. And though the demonization, to use that word again, was already present and lingering from church history and from the late ancient age, the feelings of hostility and the need to tear down and once again deconstruct, destroy structures or teachings that were considered occult raged in Europe again. And of course, we've seen this different times, including the witch craze, which began in the medieval period and lasted for centuries, including up through what was considered to be the Age of Reason in the 1700s. So, witch crazes, backlashes, so-called demonizations, a term that exemplifies its own history, have been going on against practices that were associated with the pre-Christian belief system since late antiquity.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense as to how the satanic was tied so much to the occult, because that was going to be one of the questions that I asked you. But if you're looking at one group of people kind of calling the shots and defining things by how they feel, then the satanic naturally would be the evil, and everything that's occult or outside of itself would then be considered satanic or evil.
Yeah, and it's human nature. One of the things that I'm trying to do today, as you're well aware, is redefine the satanic according to more esoteric terms, according to terms that were understood more closely, concepts, principles, points of view that were understood more clearly, I think, by some of the romantic poets and writers of the satanic as a force of rebellion, usurpation, overturning of staid, calcified structures, persistent questioning, rejection of conformity, rejection of hive mentality. And I think there's an esoteric reading of the satanic that can be made and defended in that vein, which I'm attempting to do. But I find that there are some people who are quick to embrace my defense of the occult or other metaphysical practices and feel very understood, but want to shut the door really quickly when you start to go in the direction of the satanic, because that word for them, as with the word occult for the larger mainstream culture, is so sullied and so defined by Western convention that it can't be revisited. And I'm making an effort to revisit. This may be a windmill that's too great, for even me to tilt at, but this journey, this errand is underway. So there's nothing, you don't turn back once you've begun an errand in the classical sense. So, but I would like people to understand that, we all feel mischaracterized. None of us want the terms by which we refer to ourselves to be defined by their adversaries. So in as much as people want terms, as I want terms, like metaphysical or New Age or occult or esoteric, to be understood more plainly with regard to how the practitioner, him or herself, perceives those terms, and not to be understood just strictly according to convention, which would leave us in a very arid place, I would say let's not stop there, and let's understand that if we're using a term like satanic or a term like demon, there's a historical integrity there, there's an esoteric counterstory there that can be understood as well.
You had mentioned a little while back when I had brought up this conversation that horror was one of the only genres that corresponds with belief. I wondered if you could dig into that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, for example, if people watch a movie like The Exorcist, enormously powerful movie. It's understandable that people would be influenced by it. I've been influenced by it. But, that classic 1973 horror movie has probably given people in the Western world, throughout the North American continent and in other parts of the world as well, throughout Europe, their conception of what an exorcism is, what possession is, what demonic influences are. I don't even know that the term exorcism would be widespread in our culture today. It might be a crossword puzzle term if it weren't for the fact that movie became such a massive cultural statement. So, we all slip into this. These images become so powerful that we look at them and we say to ourselves, wow, well, that's what possession is. That's what, an exorcism is, in the same way.
Convincing enough.
Right. In the same way that if you said to somebody, what is Snow White? They picture the Disney cartoon immediately, although the legend of Snow White, greatly predates the Disney cartoon and has been around for a long time. But if you ask somebody, what is that, you'll get the answer. If you ask somebody what is a vampire, they picture Bela Lugosi. And it's a tribute to how defining he was of that role, and it's extraordinary, and it's important, and it's not without significance, but that doesn't tell the full cultural story. So, horror is really interesting, where if I watch an episode of Star Trek, I don't believe that Captain Kirk is real. I dig Captain Kirk, but I'm like, yeah, I get it. This is a character. Luke Skywalker is a character. He's an archetype, but he's a character. But like, if we watch a horror movie, particularly something that's religiously based, so I'm thinking maybe of like the Conjuring movies, right, Exorcist, other movies, in the realm of possession, we think to ourselves, this is a depiction of the actual, so there is a real strong correspondence between horror and belief, perhaps in ways that no other genre really occupies.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's thinking back to my own being an ex-evangelical, I very much bought into all of that. So I remember the very first time that I watched The Conjuring, like I very much went into it knowing like, oh my God, this is a true story.
Right. And
so it scared the shit out of me.
Sure.
Also, it was a very well done movie. I mean, I really enjoyed it. It was beautifully shot, well acted. But I remember it just being this terrifying experience for me. But even then, there was something right after The Exorcist had come out. I believe like that the Catholic Church had seen this mass number of people going in to try and be a priest so that they could be exorcists and do all of this stuff. There was a very real draw from that, and actually that kind of pushed. The Conjuring did the same for me, so I ended up going that route, and I was given the there's like spiritual gifts within the Christian faith that different people have, and I don't know if they're like from birth to till your death, or if they can come in like different waves or anything like that. But one of the ones that I had was the discerning of spirits. One of them was exorcism, just flat out, and then faith or something like that. But it was always interesting to me because there were multiple times, because I very much consider myself a spiritual person still, and there were times like when I'd be brought into a situation where it was believed that there was a demonic presence or a demonic force on somebody, or like, just kind of oppressing somebody, and I never got the sense of malevolence from the spirits that they were talking about. It was always just, from my background, a black and white, like, you've got angels, you've got demons, you've got good, you've got bad. But one of the things that ended up making me question everything was this recognition that the spiritual world wasn't so black and white.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point. That's a wonderful point. And it's funny, another of the ways that horror and belief intersect is in the evolution of the term witch or witchcraft within our time. If you go back to the 1960s, it was the Hammer horror movie which defined the witch in many people's minds. Maybe you had some lunatic being portrayed by Vincent Price, on your shirt, going around hunting witches, or, just as often you had witches portrayed as a malevolent presence. And yet the notion, thanks to L. Frank Baum, author of The Wizard of Oz and a theosophist and the later movie adaptation of The Wizard of Oz, the notion of the good witch had also been presented as an indelible counterpoint in our culture. So you kind of had both images wrestling in the public mind, neither of which were exactly tapped into any deep religious or spiritual retention or tradition, but they were part of popular culture, and so they're part of a legitimate culture. And then as the 60s gave way to late 60s, Woodstock generation, 70s, and you had a witchcraft revolution that was popularized by some people like Gerald Gardner and Margaret Murray, among others, who argued for the retention of witchcraft traditions in Western Europe, which is a dicey proposition, but nonetheless, that was their case. And, the term witch morphed into a term of healthful rebellion, which it has remained so this day. And so the term witch today is very polarizing in some sections of our culture. Obviously, it has malevolent association, and in many other sections of our culture, it's seen as a very healthful, rebellious reclaiming of a female-positive, nature-based ancient tradition that's being remade in our time. And so, again, I'd like people to just dig that and just sit with that and be aware of that. If we defer to dominant culture for the definition of terms, however far out a term may be, then the reclamation of the term witch would never have occurred. So, we can't just stop, in my estimation. It's not just our job to say, wow, well, we've ratcheted up a victory for human potential by reclaiming that term. Now let's slam the door. My idea is that you have to keep reopening the door in legitimate ways, not just for theater, not just with pageantry, but in legitimate ways, in ways that have esoteric, that are informed by either historical integrity or authentic esoteric search, because when you do that, you expand everybody's search. So, horror gives us like certain tropes and ways of interpreting things, and they're important, but we can't just stop there, or stop with conventional religion or with familiarity. Certain things that have come down to us that we might think of as settled fact or tradition. Heaven is up there, hell is down there. Well, what is up? What is down? These things are just invented concepts, basically, and everybody always thinks that they're right side up. We just happen to live under gravity, which is mass being attracted to itself. So there's no real up and down, even, if we want to get into basics. But the fact is, stuff that gets passed down to us seems true by dint of familiarity. Familiarity is not truth. Something's not true because it's old, and something's not false because it's new, or vice versa. These things have to be defined and verified by each generation and each individual within it. And I say, don't just defer to habitual thinking, which we refer to as tradition or which we think of as settled fact because it's so overwhelmingly familiar.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I'm 31 right now, and I feel like I'm only starting to learn how to not trust that truth based on pop culture or like our surroundings, whoever won that victory and is now defining certain things. You mentioned all that to say, like, I had the tendency to look back at historical events in a very one-sided way. So when you mentioned the witchcraft revolution of the 60s, like Gerald Gardner, like everything that he was doing, it's funny because when I think back to the 60s, I think the beginning of the Jesus movement, and I think the rise of the satanic panic. And although all of that could have very well been a response to this witchcraft revolution. No, it's a fascinating, it's always interesting to look at what schisms are occurring in a society and what they're responding to. It looks like the satanic panic, where there was this complete myth that's been thoroughly debunked, including quite recently in reportage in places like the New York Times, LA Times, Vox. There was this notion that daycare workers and high school librarians and malevolent heavy metal listening teens and other people, serial killers, were organizing themselves into these cabals of child worshipping, child sacrificing, cultic circles. Completely false. Completely false. These things became the subject of some of the longest running criminal trials in the history of America, and all that the record bore out is that innocent lives were ruined en masse. And yet some people are still very attached to these ideas, and it's interesting to ask why. The thing that was happening concurrent to this, and it's very important to understand this because this is not a decoy, it's part of the same story. The thing that was happening concurrent to the satanic panic was you had a wave of unreported abuse going on in mainstream institutions, most prominently the Catholic Church and the Boy Scouts of America. So much so that today the Boy Scouts of America has had to declare bankruptcy in order to defend itself against class lawsuits from tens of thousands of claimants and survivors. Likewise, there have been, at this point, probably close to 30 Catholic parishes or organizations that have had to declare bankruptcy for the same reasons. And sometimes people will hear this and say, aha, you're changing the subject. It's exactly the same subject, and that's the point. It's not a decoy, it's the same topic. What was going on in the satanic panic was that people with no power in our society, daycare workers, camp counselors, teachers, heavy metal musicians, loners, pentagram-wearing librarians, were getting accused of crimes that were absolutely fraudulent, non-existent. It wasn't long ago that somebody was maintaining to me that Michael Aquino, the founder of the Temple of Set, who died recently, was involved in some of these child abuse cases, and unbeknownst to the person who was making these references and talking to me about news coverage that was literally a generation old, is that Aquino was not even in San Francisco at the time that the accusations would have placed him there. I mean, I cite that because it's so ordinary. It's just one fact out of many dozens that poke total holes in, and there are hundreds of them, unfortunately, and I wish that there weren't, because all of these facts are lives that were distressed or ruined by false charges. And the reason that I'm bringing up all this together as one whole is not because, well, these guys were good and these guys were bad. It has nothing whatsoever to do with that. It's the social cycle that, like witch hunts, like racism, like anti-Semitism, like trans bashing, like satanic panic, when there's something going on in society within powerful quarters that we don't want to acknowledge, deal with, bring to light, prosecute, we tend as a culture, and I'm sure this goes on in cultures all over the world, to dislocate the criminal activity, the moral crises, the cruelty onto people who are helpless and can't do anything to defend themselves. So it's not incidental. It's actually one and the same, that you have actual incidences of abuse going on within the most mainstream institutions imaginable, large, powerful, wealthy institutions. Two of the most prominent examples, although not the only ones, being the Boy Scouts and the Catholic Church. And now we know all this, and it's coming to light in Canada, in the United States, in France, you name it. But what's going on at precisely the same time is
you have this satanic panic messaging, which is completely fraudulent and debunked by years of unnecessary trials, which took terrible tolls on the lives of everyday innocent people. And all of this stuff is being displaced onto the helpless. Isn't that part of the human story? Isn't that the human story? The search for a hidden foe. And where is that foe found? Well, it's never found among the pharmaceutical companies. It's rarely found among, the rich and the powerful in the actual sense of things. It's found among those people who are easily scapegoated, whether it's homeless children who are accused of being witches or the spawns of demons, in Central Africa and Indonesia and some of the cities of India, or whether it's women who are accused of witchcraft in societies that are quickly industrializing and people are experiencing economic dislocation or agricultural problems, or whether it's the daycare worker, in the 1980s and 90s who, as women are returning to the workforce and they're becoming, the daycare worker, for example, is becoming a more and more vital part of the functioning of the economy. Suddenly, they're the bad guy. They're the bad guy. Changes tend to uptick the hunger and the search for a scapegoat. And a scapegoat is always found. And that scapegoat is almost always found among the weak. So I know that, that's sort of a long treatise on the satanic panic, but it's so important to understand that, these things are deflections. They're decoys. They tend to occur in cultures, societies, epochs all over the world and throughout time, where the ills that are going on in one quarter get displaced onto another. So, in Tsarist Russia, for example, you have a terrible concentration of economic power and no ability for the average individual to improve his or her circumstances in life. So what occurs? The writing of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So, blame these dastardly, globalist, shadowy, Jewish, Kabbalistic figures for the actual ills in society, which is an untenable concentration of wealth and power. That's the human story, and that's the story of the satanic panic.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. Just I guess speaking about history on like a longer scale than just something from the 60s to the 80s. Just my mind is connecting different things, but it's the exact same situation from like the Inquisition in Spain. It's the same story, it's the same rhetoric, it's the same attacking of people who are becoming, well, I don't know. I guess in Spain it was less people who were becoming more prevalent in society and more just, I don't know, people wanted their land or something like that. But,
yeah, and we see it in this country where, you say terrorism and people think in terms of Arab terrorism, but of course we all know by the numbers that white supremacist terrorism is the real serious problem that we face in this generation, but that's difficult to deal with, and putting it onto somebody else who might be more marginal is easier to deal with. That's kind of a rudimentary example, but it's true, and it's the human story. It's simply the human story, and people are very attached to it. I don't expect to change any minds. I don't say this stuff because I expect to change minds, only because I say it because people who understand this situation are sometimes helped to realize, okay, I'm not alone. This helps crystallize it. This helps gel it. But your average person who's dedicated to this narrative is not going to be swayed by this in the slightest.
Yeah. Something you mentioned a second ago, you were talking about just that need for scapegoats. And I don't know. I don't know if that's just like a desire or another reason for somebody to not accept responsibility for themselves. But it reminded me of that. I think it's in like Leviticus or in Ezekiel, one of those old books, where the term scapegoat had come from these two goats, one that they would sacrifice to their god and another that they would send out into the wilderness to be devoured by this demon Azazel. Which, first off, I would love to see that film. If somebody wants to make a horror movie about Azazel, I think that would be fucking awesome.
Right.
So, if any producers are listening to this, but it's just such a part of human nature, I guess, just to dismiss responsibility, and I feel like that's what I've found in a lot of, in a good amount of religions. For myself, is just that it's that desire to push it away and not accept your responsibility for yourself.
Yes.
Do you think that that kind of plays into a lot of this panic, a lot of this like this demonization of other groups?
Well, it certainly is more dramatic, it's more enthralling, it's more involving to imagine that there's this evil group somewhere, whether they're called the Illuminati or whether, it's bound up in the satanic panic or whether it's some presumed hidden maleficent group that's doing dirty deeds, rather than my health insurance carrier, or rather than the pharmaceutical, industry. I mean, right now at this particular moment, there's a discussion going on in Congress about the government negotiating pharmaceutical prices so that necessary life-saving drugs or quality of life preserving drugs are more affordable. This can be done. It goes on everywhere, and by all lights, it looks like it's about to fail. It's about to fail. So what is today's date? Today is October 27th. We're speaking at 3:34 p.m. Eastern Time. May I be wrong, okay? But it looks like it's about to fail. So we're going to go another generation without any pharmaceutical price controls. That's bad for just about everybody listening to this. Just about everybody listening to this, whatever their outlook or political persuasion, has got something to lose by the fact that that plan is going down, okay? But is anybody going to be, turned on about this? Is anybody going to be very upset about this, aside from, a handful of people? Tomorrow somebody will say something about the Illuminati and everybody will go crazy. Like, yeah, that's right. Go get him, Alex. Right on, whereas it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. But the fact that pharmaceutical companies are price gouging is not nearly as exciting and interesting, even though it impacts what's going to happen to you tomorrow. What's going to happen to you tomorrow? And, I've got people from time to time on social media who say, you don't believe there are malevolent forces in this world? Of course there are malevolent forces. I've got a fucking refrigerator magnet from one of them up on my refrigerator. It's my health carrier. It's people who engage in predatory lending. It's finance companies that take advantage of people with usurious or obscurantist credit card policies. It's hospitals that bill people for insane prices because they think they'll get the beleaguered patient to bug his or her insurance company. It's insurance companies that use coding procedures to deny you coverage that you've paid for and then ask you to resubmit and resubmit and resubmit because they know, according to an actuarial table, that 10% of people are going to go away. So I could go on and on and on, and this doesn't even touch on climate change or other stuff. And we all participate in it to some greater or lesser extent, but the fact is, yeah, there's all that stuff going on, but it's not that interesting, is it? It's not that interesting. The Illuminati is much more interesting, even though it's non-existent, even though, it existed for about 9 years in Bavaria in the late 1700s until the Bavarian government, the aristocracy, brutally cracked down on secret societies and excluded people and outlawed people and ruined people's lives because they were basically radical Freemasons who believed in separation of church and state, the stripping of privilege from the church, who believed in the enforcement of individual rights and so on and so forth. And yet the real history to a critical fraction of people is not interesting. The real problems that we face in this world, which can be fixed, are uninteresting to a certain fraction of people, but start talking about the satanic panic or the Illuminati or conspiracies and the blood starts pumping, and that's interesting. And we dig drama. And we don't want to get into the fine points of detail, even though that's what's affecting our lives.
Yeah, I mean, we're dealing with this real horror on a daily basis. Yeah. I mean, God, my fucking roof, still haven't taken care of that. Whole mold situation, it's terrible. And it's this horrific thing, but there's still, and I don't know, maybe it is the drama of it, because I do want to disassociate that from that as much as possible. But so what is it, just the drama that keeps that draw to the genre of horror?
Wow, that's a wonderful question. We do dig being scared. We like roller coasters. We like loud noises. We like the prospect that something is scary, something might happen, something could happen. It gives us a kind of thrill. It gives us a feeling of life. I think when we're watching confrontations, contests, scary things, it's not altogether bad. I mean, I dig it too. I just watched Squid Game, for the first time. I felt like I was watching Parasite meets The Hunger Games. I couldn't quite get that out of my mind, with a bit of Eyes Wide Shut thrown in the latter half. But yeah, I dug it. I thought it had a statement to make. And I think that I just saw Halloween Kills the other night. I liked the music, I'll say that. I enjoyed the John Carpenter score was very good. But we dig being scared. It gives us a feeling of life. And also, look, horror does expose us to things that could possibly be true. I really grooved to M. Night Shyamalan's movie, what was it about Split, about the figure with the split personality.
Okay. Yeah.
And one of his he had multiple personalities, one of which, was super strong, one of which was self-confident, one of which was something else. And, it was like a new thought framed horror film where at the end, the lead character, the protagonist says, we are what we believe we are. And I thought that's so brilliant that Shyamalan used the horror genre to reflect back to us a basic truth of the human situation, whether you see it psychologically or metaphysically. And so we do get exposed to things that have a toehold, have a basis in human experience. So if it's a poltergeist movie or a haunting movie or something like that, it's exciting because we feel on the edges of our psyche this could be true. And as it happens, according to centuries of human testimony, as well as psychical research and other things, another topic entirely, we are right. We're right. So it's cool to experience these things in a fictionalized way that might have an aspect of truth to it. And I think we enjoy that as well.